Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to have you. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a few brief housekeeping items as we move forward. This video is going to be recorded and we will be posting this on our site at the conclusion of the event so that people can view it afterwards if they weren't able to do so. We also have closed captioning available, which you can go to the bottom of your screen and it should be available so that you can view those if you would like to. And so with that, the Q&A portion, we also will have a Q&A portion, which we'll be doing near the mid to end of the event. So if you have any questions, go down to your Q&A, you'll see a little Q&A box and you can input your questions there. And we'll get to your questions through the program during our Q&A portion. So with that, I want to get us started. I'm excited to introduce to you Ambassador Steve Mull, who is our Vice Provost for Global Affairs at the University of Virginia. In this role, he's responsible for developing a wide array of services, programs, experiences, and strategic partnerships that promote global imagination within the university community. Steve joined us in the August of 2018 after 36 years of career in the U.S. Foreign Service, which did include serving as acting Undersecretary for Political Affairs, implementation of the Iran nuclear deal, and service as ambassador to Poland and Lithuania. He holds the personal rank of Career Ambassador, which is the highest rank in the Foreign Service, U.S. Foreign Service, and he is a 1980 graduate of Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Steve, welcome. Thank you, and for introducing our speaker today.
Thank you so much, Maggie, and a warm good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for an event we've been looking forward to for a long time here at UVA, featuring one of UVA's most distinguished alumni in the world of diplomacy, Ambassador John Campbell, who I remember, whose reputation I remember so well from my own years in the Foreign Service as one of the smartest, most effective, and one of the most perceptive diplomats, certainly in my generation, in the U.S. Foreign Service. Currently, Ambassador Campbell is the Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. And he's the author of a new book on Nigeria that was just published in December called Nigeria and the Nation State, Rethinking Diplomacy with the Post-Colonial World. Ambassador Campbell is also the author of a very well-received and well-reviewed book about Nigeria from 2010 called Nigeria Dancing on the Brink. He also writes the blog Africa in Transition. From 1975 until 2007, Ambassador Campbell served as a Foreign Service officer, and he served twice in Nigeria, which has lent him so much on-the-ground expertise that informs all of his writing and commentary. He was the chief of the political section in the U.S. Embassy from 1988 until 1990, and then returned as U.S. Ambassador from 2004 until 2007. He has also served overseas in Lyon, Paris, Geneva, and Pretoria, and he also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Resources. He was the Dean of the State Department's Foreign Service Institute School of Language Studies and Director of the State Department's Office of UN Political Affairs. From 2007 to 2008, he was a visiting professor of international relations at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and he also took some time off from the State Department to serve as a mid-career fellow at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. Prior to his career in the Foreign Service, he taught British and French history at Mary Baldwin College, now Mary Baldwin University, nearby here in Stanton. Ambassador Campbell graduated from the University of Virginia in 1966 with a bachelor's degree in history, and he stayed on to get a master's degree also in history in 1967 before going on to earn a PhD in English and history at the University of Wisconsin in 1970. So Ambassador Campbell, John, we're so delighted to host you today. And I have to point out to our audience that you are wearing a tie from your first year at UVA that you bought on the corner. It has survived the years very, very well. And so we're so excited to see you wearing it again, and welcome home to UVA. I'd like to turn the floor over to you for some few opening remarks on your perspective on Nigeria. And we look forward to taking questions from the audience as we go through the program. Over to you, John.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you for your very warm and generous introduction. And of course, I am delighted to be before a University of Virginia audience once again. The purpose of my book was really twofold. First, I wanted to deepen my understanding of how Nigeria really works. But then secondly, I also wanted to warn Americans against making the same mistakes in Africa that they did in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Up to now, the United States has avoided those mistakes. Not, I would say, because of the wisdom of US policy or the skill of its diplomats. And I can say that because I was one of them. But rather because Africa has only rarely been a diplomatic preoccupation of the United States. We were never a colonial power. Only some 3% of world trade involves Africa. And in fact, American investment in Africa and trade in Africa is really limited to certain primary commodities, particularly oil and gas. But I'm arguing that is all so yesterday, that in the current decade, Africa is likely to become much more salient in US foreign policy. Really, let me suggest there are 4 reasons. First is demography. The population of sub-Saharan Africa is already double that of North Central America and the Caribbean. Nigeria has a population of about 214 million people now. It is anticipated by demographers, particularly at the UN, that by 2050, the population will be about 450 million. And at that point, it will have displaced the United States as the 3rd largest country in the world by population. This demographic explosion has all kinds of really quite interesting consequences. For one thing, it's taking place against a backdrop in which populations are either static or declining in East Asia, in Europe, and now, according to the latest census figures, the United States. And this is something that is new. So Africa's population is increasing at a phenomenal rate. At the same time, much of the rest of the world's population is either static or declining. Second point, Nigeria can't feed the 214 million people it has now. It's very difficult to see where it's going to be able to feed or how it's going to be able to feed 450 million people 30 years from now. So what does that imply? That would imply a huge outward migration. Already underway, there's some estimates that there are as many as 2 million Nigerians in China. The Nigerian diaspora community in the United States has been remarkably successful, as it has been in the UK. Most of the outflow from Nigeria, however, has been to elsewhere in West Africa. But surely this is something that is going to accelerate. And as we have seen on our own southern border, mass migration of peoples is inherently destabilizing unless it's very, very carefully managed. So demography. Secondly, disease. One of the consequences of the explosion of the population in sub-Saharan Africa has been the destruction of the rainforest. Well, what does that do? Among other things, what it does is it makes it easier for diseases to jump from animals to humans. We already saw that was what happened with respect to HIV/AIDS. It's what happened with respect to Ebola. And there is no reason whatsoever to think that that process has come to an end, and every reason to think that it will probably accelerate. Third, potential markets and investments. I've already commented that American investment in Africa is relatively small, but with that huge growth in population, that means there's going to be a big market for razor blades and soap and shampoo. And we have to anticipate that the American business community will be increasingly interested in what the possibilities are in Africa. And then fourth, and perhaps of greatest immediate concern, is security, particularly the fact that radical jihadism is now rooted in the Sahel. There is a real danger that the Sahel can become a safe haven similar to that of Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda. The security situation in Nigeria and in the Sahel is, I would say, dire. The Nigerian military has been unable to defeat Boko Haram and its various jihadi offshoots. There is a low-level insurgency in the oil patch. In Yoruba land, the most advanced part of the country around Lagos, there is increasing interest in separatism. And there is a crime wave centered really on kidnapping, which covers the entire country. It's very interesting that, according to the New York Times, when President Buhari met virtually with Secretary Blinken yesterday or the day before, he specifically asked that the headquarters of the United States Africa Command be moved from Stuttgart to Africa. This was a complete reversal of the traditional Nigerian and indeed West African position, which has been that AFRICOM was essentially a neo-colonialist construct, and they wanted to have as little to do with it as possible. It's an illustration, I think, of not only how dire the security situation in Nigeria is, but the fact that the government fully recognizes how dire it is, and that it is prepared to go off in really completely different directions from the way it has before. Maybe that's enough to get us started.
Well, thanks very much, John. I have to say, listening to your recounting these four major challenges and opportunity of demography, disease, trade and investment, and security, with the exception of growing trade and investment opportunities, the other three factors actually sound quite disturbing. And of course, you know better than I, even in the best of times, so many newly independent nations in Africa, none of which are nearly as complex and challenging as Nigeria. It's a challenge forging a national identity, a national purpose, a national mission, and of course, throughout its existence as an independent country, Nigeria has struggled more than most with these. So as the demographic challenges and health challenges and security challenges seem to multiply, even more. I wonder, is capacity to govern Nigeria going to keep pace with that? And I could imagine a pretty depressing outlook for Nigeria, which is all the more disturbing given its strategic importance on the whole continent of Africa as its most populous. So is there any grounds for hope for the future for Nigeria?
There are plenty of Nigerians who ask those exact same questions. Nigeria is an altogether artificial construct. It was put together by the British in 1914. They amalgamated some 350 different ethnic groups that had never been part of a previous entity into a state. So it's a colonial construct, and a sense of national identity is extremely weak. Plenty of polling data that shows people's first loyalty is to their family, second to religion, thirdly to their ethnic group, fourth to the region in which they come. And oh yes, by the way, I guess we're also Nigerian. So you don't have a well of national identity and patriotism that you can draw on. Most Nigerians have as little to do with the formal state as they possibly can. They don't trust the police. The army is seen as a regular perpetrator of human rights abuses. So what do you do about it? Thoughtful Nigerians suggest that what's needed is a kind of sovereign national conference in which representatives of all of the stakeholders, they love that word, come together and essentially look at rebuilding Nigeria from the ground up, with a particular focus on decentralization and meaningful federalism. In theory, Nigeria is a federal state, but it isn't really. It's really actually a highly centralized state, largely because most government funding comes from oil, and oil is owned by the Nigerian government. So if you think through a thorough rebuilding of the Nigerian state, and if you look at the really astonishing success of Nigerians outside of Nigeria, I think there's grounds for optimism. Difficulty? The people who currently run Nigeria are satisfied enough with the situation as it has existed up to now. The top 1 or 2% of the population are the beneficiaries of the oil revenue. And if you were to rebuild the Nigerian state from ground up, they no longer would be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. You mentioned in your opening remarks that it's important for the United States to avoid some of the mistakes it's made in Iraq, Afghanistan, in Southeast Asia, as it develops a policy towards Nigeria. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what are the U.S. interests in Nigeria, and how should we best pursue them and defend them in spite or in light of all of these challenges?
The primary U.S. interest in Nigeria is stability, or rather that Nigeria not implode and drag the rest of West Africa down with it. This is closely related to a long-standing US policy goal, which is to support a democratic trajectory in Nigeria. For good reason. Most of us who know Nigeria tend to think that a democratic trajectory promotes stability. In other words, one helps promote the other. I think the economic dimension is much less important now than, say, when I was ambassador to Nigeria. In those days, Nigeria produced 2 million barrels of oil a day, of which 1 million came to the United States. And further, successive Nigerian governments said that if our normal sources of supply from the Middle East were cut off for whatever reason, they would do what they could to increase oil production to make up the difference. Well, now we import almost no oil at all from Nigeria. The result of fracking and the availability of oil in Canada, Mexico, and other places that are closer to home. So the economic aspect of it is essentially aspirational. I mean, are there markets that could be developed that would be attractive to American business? And then there's the question of security. The jihadist groups that are active and that we tend to lump together as Boko Haram, what is their goal? Well, their goal is the destruction of the Nigerian state and its replacement with something rather like the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, something rather like it. We have to be careful because I don't think that Boko Haram is an outgrowth or an offspring of the Islamic State or of Al-Qaeda. I think it's largely indigenous in terms of its origins, but their goal is an Islamic State like that of ISIS in the Middle East. Such a state would, of course, be inherently anti-Western and would pursue values that are antithetical to our own. It's really interesting to me that Boko Haram or its various offshoots have never directly attacked American installations in northern Nigeria. Now that could be because there are very few of them, and those that are there would be very hard targets indeed. But they have certainly attacked European installations of various sorts. And a major source of revenue for them is kidnapping. And of course, the ideal kidnap victim is the citizen of a wealthy West European country, because in those wealthy West European countries, you can develop a good deal of popular agitation for the government to do something to free the victims, and that doing something normally involves paying an enormous ransom, which, by the way, the states involved all deny doing. I would argue that that Boko Haram is not at present a security threat to the United States. It certainly could become one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the challenges of serving as American ambassador to such a complicated place like Nigeria. I remember well from my own experiences serving as an ambassador, the multitude of interest groups that have an effect and an interest in what the US does in any country in the world. And I remember from my years of working in the State Department that there is an unusually large and diverse group of passionate players here within the United States, really concerned about what the US does in Nigeria. There's, of course, increasingly successful and growing size of the Nigerian diaspora here in the United States, which has been very successful. There's the US energy industry that is heavily invested and involved in developing the energy sector in Nigeria. There's the human rights community, which is so concerned about human rights and corruption in Nigeria, and those who are interested in religious freedom issues. I have to tell you, I think it was my very last day on the job in the Foreign Service when I was acting as undersecretary, I received a call from a relatively high up activist from a non-governmental organization who was very concerned about the Fulani tribes people and their reported attacks on Christians and the right of Christians to worship freely. So I remember thinking in that call, what a complex relationship to manage with so many interest groups. How do those play out, and what were the implications of that for you serving as ambassador?
Well, for one thing, I was ambassador from 2004 to 2007. And it was very much easier then than it is now. It was very much easier because up until about late 2005, 2006, we could travel everywhere, and we did so. When I was political counselor in the late 1980s, my goal was to always have a member of the political section on the road. In 1989, 3 female officers, the embassy was then in Lagos, in an embassy car with an embassy driver and lots of water, set off and spent 3 weeks going all over the North on a familiarization visit without any security whatsoever. And they didn't need any. Now, of course, it is difficult to travel beyond the beltway that surrounds Abuja. This means that our direct access to what is actually going on in the country is limited. The Nigerian army for a long time has closed off parts of the North to the Western media. It even at times tries to restrict what non-governmental organizations can do. Further, the relationship when I was ambassador had a different quality, I would suggest, from what it has now. And that is President Obasanjo and President Bush had a close personal relationship. President Obasanjo was the first head of state of a large African country to visit Washington after 9/11 to convey official condolences. So the texture was different. And Nigeria in those days was very far from being a failing state. It was the hegemon in West Africa, and it pursued a foreign policy based on values congruent with our own, which is to say, opposition to military coups, search for stability, support for the establishment of regional organizations like the African Union or the Economic Community of West African States. Very, very different now. So when I was ambassador, you could take those various interest groups that you listed, virtually all of which were present then, but you could deal with them in a much more direct and matter-of-fact way than certainly I would be comfortable doing now, were I the ambassador.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, the world's certainly gotten a lot more complex, especially over the past few years. It would be an unenviable job to have. I'm sure you're right. John, I'd like to turn to our audience who've been submitting a lot of really interesting questions. The first I'd like to raise is from Dean Salpini, who asks, how has U.S. foreign policy and assistance programs responded to the threat of terrorist activity in northern Nigeria from Boko Haram?
First of all, to talk about assistance, U.S. assistance in Nigeria is very narrowly focused. It's PEPFAR, which is directed towards HIV/AIDS. There is also a malaria program, and there is a program designed to promote the education of girls. There are other very small programs designed to promote democracy and that sort of thing. In terms of responding to Boko Haram, up until now, the Nigerian government has tended to keep offers of assistance at arm's length. For example, in the immediate aftermath of the Chibok schoolgirl kidnapping, the United States, Canada, a number of other Western countries all offered to help. And the offers to help were always welcomed and accepted, but never actually could be implemented. There were always issues and difficulties. What the Nigerians wanted, again, until fairly recently, was they wanted to buy sophisticated military equipment from the United States, which very often we were reluctant to sell. Reluctant to sell because from our perspective, it was what they wanted was very often the wrong kind of equipment to use in an insurgency situation. In other words, we were applying the very hard lessons that we learned in Afghanistan and in Iraq. But the Nigerian military particularly didn't much want to hear it. So again, up until now, the US has not been deeply involved in the situation in the North. Even the training, US training of Nigerian military has been extremely limited. The number, for example, of Nigerian military officers enrolled in graduate schools in the United States, you could count at 10, 20, or 30 in a country with 214 million people. So there's not much there.
Oh, I see. Corruption is another issue that's always so commonly associated with Nigeria. And one member of our audience, Sue Kumleben, was wondering how and through what means the corruption challenge might be addressed in Nigeria.
It's a very good question, and it's extraordinarily complicated. The roots of corruption are, in fact, not just colonial, but very often pre-colonial. It has to do with gift giving. For example, if you're passing through a police checkpoint, the policeman comes up to your window and he doesn't ask you for a bribe to get through the checkpoint. What he says is, "What do you have for me today?" Now, the policeman is doing this in large part because he has to keep body and soul together. His wages are extremely low. They are very often in arrears for months. Same is true the wages of soldiers. And so corruption of that sort becomes a societal workaround, and it extends all over the place. So that if in fact you need almost any kind of government service, you, from an American perspective, will be asked to pay a bribe. From a Nigerian perspective, it's a workaround. Nigerians make an important distinction between reasonable corruption and gross corruption. Reasonable corruption is the policeman, levying a toll on getting through. Gross corruption is the former minister of petroleum who assaulted away, we don't really know how much, millions, if not billions of dollars outside of the country. So in other words, you can't cure corruption by waving a magic wand. It's deeply embedded in how a society functions. If you're going to eliminate police checkpoints, you've got to pay the police. If you're going to pay the police, you've got to change the tax system. If you're going to change the tax system, those who benefit from oil are going to benefit from oil rather less. And they're the ones that, in fact, have the political power.
I see. We were talking, in addition to, it's not just negative connotations that people have with Nigeria, there's a very positive one also. We talked a little bit about it before the program started, about how entrepreneurially gifted Nigerians are and how increasingly prosperous the Nigerian diaspora has been in the United States. So when you think about the demographic challenges that Nigeria faces with a exploding population, that it seems it'll be very challenging for the economy to keep up with its rapidly growing population. We have a question from Priyam Sheth in the audience, wondering about whether there's a way or an interest in taking advantage of these entrepreneurial skills of Nigerians to help them grow the Nigerian economy, to meet these demographic demands, and to integrate Nigeria more effectively into the world economy.
There are all kinds of strategies that are advanced in Nigeria itself. Nigerians are acutely aware of the fact that their human capital is extremely rich. And if you can unleash it, all kinds of things become possible. The question is, how do you do that in a society that is organized the way Nigeria is? And add to that the security challenges. After all, it's very hard to open a business if you are worried about it being burned down by Boko Haram.
Indeed, indeed, sure.
The New York Times a few months ago ran a quite fascinating series of articles on the Nigerian diaspora's influence in the United States on entertainment, fashion, food. Look at the best-selling American authors now. A very high percentage of them are either Nigerian or they are Nigerian American. It shows what they can do when they get out from under the system that they're under.
Oh, indeed, indeed. We have a question from Oba Adeoye. Nigeria has a way of reinventing itself. The situation is now similar, he thinks, to the Abacha years from 1993 to 1998, although maybe less dire now. In your opinion, can the elections of 2023 serve as a catalyst for yet another round of reinvention, much as the 1999 election of Obasanjo was?
I would suggest that the situation in Nigeria now is much more dire than it was under Abacha because of the breakdown of security in general. Plenty of Nigerians that I talked to actually question whether there will be elections in 2023. That, in other words, whether the current system will hold together well enough that you can actually conduct elections. There's an interesting thing about elections. Since Nigeria ended a generation of military rule, there have been regular elections. Elections held every 5 years. Early on, voter turnout was somewhere usually between 75 and 80% of those eligible. The last elections that took place, it had dropped to 32%. In other words, people are simply opting out of normal political participation.
Because they're just becoming more apathetic
And
about it. If elections were canceled, would there be much of an outcry among Nigerians, or do you think that people wouldn't respond?
There would be an outcry amongst those Nigerians with the greatest contact with the outside world, particularly those in Lagos, who of course get media attention as well. So there would be outcry, all right. But I think the reason why the percentage of voters has dropped so is a general sense that voting doesn't matter because the elections have already been fixed. by the cooperating and competing elites that actually run the country.
Yeah, I see. John, I have a question from our colleague here at UVA, Miriam Bradley, who wonders what scale and kinds of impact on health and education do NGOs and charitable foundations from overseas have in Nigeria in contrast to other places in Africa?
Well, it's huge. It's huge in part because public health is pretty much in shambles. So it's NGOs, both foreign but also domestic NGOs, that deliver a wide range of medical services. The question is, one estimate is that there are 1.8 million internally displaced persons in northeastern Nigeria whose health and other statistics are fairly appalling. And yet, there are de facto barriers put up to outside organizations, be they Nigerian or be they Western, actually operating there. So the harvest truly is plenteous, the laborers are few, and a high percentage of those laborers come from the NGO community, Nigerian as well as American. When we're talking about health too, I think it's enormously important to recognize that there has been a massive drain of trained medical personnel out of Nigeria. Go into the emergency room of any big American center city hospital, and it's amazing how many of the personnel are in fact Nigerian. Why do they leave Nigeria? They leave Nigeria, they will say, because they can't practice medicine. They can't get the drugs, they can't get the bandages, nursing skills or such, that if they can, they go elsewhere.
No. I wonder, there's been a lot of scholarly work done over the years on the impact of over-reliance on natural resources in developing a nation's economy, the distortions and instability that can create in places ranging from Venezuela and Russia to many of the oil kingdoms on the Arabian Peninsula. Can you comment a little about how reliance on gas and petroleum has distorted and made more difficult Nigeria's development as a nation state?
Plenty of Nigerians think so. They will cite the fact that in 1960, Nigeria was a food exporting country. It is now a food importing country. In 1960, it had a vibrant manufacturing sector, particularly in textiles. That's gone. In 1960, there was a railway network that largely covered the country. That disappeared altogether. It is now being rebuilt, reconstructed slowly by various Chinese companies. There is a general sense amongst many that what the oil economy did was it sucked up capital that would have been available in much more labor-intensive industries. One estimate is that only 30,000 Nigerians actually work directly in petroleum. Petroleum in and of itself does not employ large numbers of people. Well, Nigeria's got 214 million. Then there is the whole failure to invest adequately in agriculture, which is where even still about half the Nigerian population earns its living. So lots and lots of Nigerians tend to see oil as a curse, not as a blessing. It's interesting. The very problem is that oil came online in enormous quantities just at the end of the Biafra War, when the country was governed by essentially a military committee. That committee failed to establish institutions that might have channeled the oil in productive areas. There's no equivalent, for example, to what the Norwegians did with respect to North Sea oil, or even an equivalent, quite a different strategy, but there's no equivalent to what Alaska has done in terms of channeling oil production. So what you end up with is a kind of free-for-all. And since oil belongs to the state, the way to get rich is through capture of the state, because what that does is it gives you access to the oil revenue. And that's how you get rich.
Wow. So can you point to any good news stories on that front? Have there been instances where the living standards, conditions for the average Nigerian have at all benefited from this wealth of oil revenue?
Well, let me give you a kind of bumper sticker. According to international financial institutions, in absolute numbers, the number of Nigerians severely impoverished is the largest in the world, larger than in India, which has 6 times the population. So the top 1 or 2% can buy apartments on Central Park South or in Belgravia or in Mayfair, love to go to Disney World, and like to shop in Beverly Hills. That's 1 or 2%. Their behavior is also a little bit different from their equivalents in the Gulf states, where the conspicuous consumption amongst the really rich in the Gulf states tends to be at home, which means there's a sort of dribble down effect. Not so in Nigeria. I haven't looked recently, but the last time I looked, there was no Rolls-Royce dealership in Nigeria. There were Mercedes-Benz dealerships, but the sort of totems of conspicuous consumption were less obvious than in other petroleum states.
You'll remember from our common experience in the Foreign Service during the Cold War, so much of U.S. foreign policy was driven by competition with the Soviet Union, especially in regions like Africa. And when the Cold War ended around 1989, 1990, the Clinton administration and then the Bush administration devoted so much effort to looking at other aspects of supporting African development, supporting the development of free markets and trade, a significant investment into health. Certainly the PEPFAR program had an enormous impact in fighting HIV/AIDS in Africa. And then in more recent years, as we saw during the Trump administration and its national security policy, the focus was much more on a return to so-called great power competition. And many of your colleagues at the Council on Foreign Relations have in recent years warned about a growing intensity of competition between the United States and China in places like Africa. Do you think that that is likely to happen, that the US and China will be increasing their competition for influence among African states? And what do you think, how would Africans respond to that?
I think we need a vastly more nuanced approach to Chinese engagement with Africa. Let's start with what Chinese are you talking about? Are you talking about Hong Kong Chinese, Taiwanese Chinese, both of whom have been there since the colonial period, are well integrated and do well? If you're talking about mainland Chinese, are you talking about enterprises owned by the People's Liberation Army? Or are you talking about enterprises where ultimately the control of them rests with the Communist Party, but often there's considerable amount of distance? I think it's also important to get our facts right. For example, there has been a good deal of rhetoric about Chinese loans to build infrastructure in Africa. And that infrastructure, of course, was built by Chinese companies. And yet, at American University, there is a group of scholars that have looked very closely at this, and they have found that most of the loans were at market rate and market terms, and most of them were for infrastructure that the African governments that were involved eagerly sought. So I think rather than reconstructing the Cold War, our job is to try to get the Beijing Chinese, the government in Beijing, to behave constructively and responsibly in Africa in a way that is congruent with their economic stake in Africa. You can't keep them out. For one thing, the Africans won't let you. That's a fool's errand. And that's why I find the kind of Cold War construct so dysfunctional, because it clouds what our policy options might be. I would also point out that Chinese behavior in Africa is really quite different from Chinese behavior in the South China Sea.
Mm-hmm. For sure. You know, for many years since the end of the Cold War, democracy promotion has been such an important element of US foreign policy in successive bipartisan administrations that pretty much came to an end in the Trump administration. But as President Biden has been on the job, he's begun talking about this great competition between the forces of autocracy and democracy. He mentioned this again in his speech last night. And then, you know, you look at a country like Nigeria. Is that a goal that's just too hard and too unrealistic in light of all of the challenges that you've so eloquently described in your book and in our talk today? Should democracy be an important goal in our relations with Nigeria?
I guess I would put it a little bit differently. I would say better and more accountable and responsive governance is a realizable goal. For example, every time the Nigerians have national elections, we get worked up about supporting the mechanics of those elections without asking very many questions about how many Nigerians actually are free agents and can vote the way they want. To my mind, it would be more constructive to say, focus on the judiciary. Court system in Nigeria is done entirely with pen and ink. You don't have computers. Takes years for a case to make its way through the court system. What does that do? Well, what that does is it means that ordinary Nigerians don't have confidence in the judiciary, and instead they turn particularly to traditional rulers for justice. I mean, justice delayed really is justice denied. Well, now, when you're talking about making courts more efficient, that's not rocket science. I mean, you know, we can provide computers. We can even provide solar power outlets for those computers where the electricity regularly fails. If, in other words, we focused on practical things that improved the quality of services delivered to the Nigerian people, that I think over time can promote the growth of a democratic culture.
Well said. It's a great point. John, I think we have time for just one last question, and this is from Kara Welch, who wonders what's the role of Nigeria's regional relationships? Might there be potential for securing the region through and to help support Nigeria's stability by developing a more cooperative relationship between Nigeria and its neighbors in West Africa? As well as in the north too, with Morocco and Algeria, who of course both have interests as well in the Sahel.
That once happened. That was the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, generally regarded as the most successful of the regional security organizations in Africa. Headquarters was in Abuja. When I was ambassador there, 70% of the budget was covered by the Nigerian government. Most of the civil servants were Nigerian. The ECOWAS did indeed function in exactly the way the questioner is suggesting. The trouble is ECOWAS's functionality clearly was too dependent on the health of the Nigerian state. When I was there, it was quite healthy. It's not healthy now. ECOWAS was dynamic, did all kinds of good things. Now, much less so. So the question is, all of those regional security organizations in Africa are intrinsically weak, and they are heavily dependent on funding from outside of Africa. The African Union, for example, gets a large percentage of its budget from the Scandinavian countries, the other wealthy Europeans. The headquarters building in Addis was built by the Chinese. So it's a case of regional organizations that have teeth are difficult to empower when the states involved are weak.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid our time is at an end, but I just want to thank you so much, Ambassador, first for your years of extraordinary service to our country in some very difficult places, and your rich insights that you've developed along the way. I know I speak for everyone in our audience in saying we've learned so much about this incredibly important country and what we should be watching for as the future unfolds in West Africa and Nigeria specifically. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, and we've learned a lot. And we hope to get you back in person, back here to Charlottesville, to get you another tie and to reintroduce you to grounds and to meet our students and faculty here in person.
Thank you so much for having me, and my thanks to the audience for their really thought-provoking questions.
Well, thank you. We look to see you in person, John. All the best to you, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. Have a great afternoon.